Good evening, everyone. Welcome back to Global Agenda at the University of Delaware. I'm Ralph Begleiter, Director of the Center for Political Communication. Global Agenda is supported by the University of Delaware's Institute for Global Studies, the Department of Political Science and International Relations, and the Department of Communication. And I'm very glad to see all of you here this evening. You know, as long as I can remember, and truly that's just little old me, the power relationship between the United States and China has been both hugely important and wildly challenging. Since Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon opened up to China in the 1970s after the Communist Revolution, American presidents have been cutting deals and making compromises with the Chinese government to keep this enormously lucrative economic relationship and this enormously important political relationship stable. We cooperate with China's military, but we make a show of force when China threatens our friends in Taiwan. We cooperate to control North Korea, but criticize on human rights. We manufacture our gadgets in China, but restrict selling the finished product back to China. China builds computers according to our designs and then uses them to spy on our companies and government. China disagrees with our political model, but sends thousands and thousands of students to the United States to study under it. But America's role in Asia goes well beyond China. U.S. interest in Asia range from protecting Japan and South Korea, where we actually have troops on the ground, to protecting the Philippines, Australia, and New Zealand, where we have treaty alliances. We worry about North Korean nukes and about Chinese military maneuvers. We guarantee safe passage to oil tankers from the Middle East to our ally Japan. We also worry about the way people are treated in Asia, from human rights and religious freedom in China and elsewhere to trafficking in women and children in Southeast Asia. Our American footprints are still very deep and very visible in places like Cambodia and Thailand and Vietnam, leftovers of long-ago wars which shaped the college years of people like me and our guest today, James Mann. Through the 1990s, I was fortunate to travel with Jim to China and elsewhere. He was a Washington correspondent, Beijing bureau chief, and foreign affairs columnist for the Los Angeles Times. He also wrote for the New Haven Journal-Courier, the Washington Post, the Philadelphia Inquirer, and the Baltimore Sun. He's won several diplomatic reporting awards for his insight on Asia. Jim has also written 3 books about U.S. relations with China and 2 more about the foreign policy of the United States during the Reagan and George W. Bush administrations. His newest book is about the Obama administration's power team, and after our program tonight, Jim will be very glad to sign copies in the lobby on your way out. He's currently working on another book, a biography of George W. Bush. James Mann is an author in residence at Johns Hopkins University's Paul H. Nitze School of Advanced International Studies. Previously, he was senior writer in residence at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, one of Washington's premier think tanks. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He earned his BA degree in sociology at Harvard. Please welcome James Mann to the University of Delaware.
Thank you, Ralph. Good to see all of you here. This is the first time I've given a speech since Marco Rubio made the water bottle famous. I want to start out with a bit of a warning, which is there's a great tradition of journalists from Washington going out across the country and claiming to have pontificating about the inside story in Washington. And I don't want to fit into that tradition. My introduction to the limits of the inside story in Washington go back to my very earliest days in the 1970s, at the time of Watergate. Some of you may remember Spiro Agnew resigned, and it came time for Richard Nixon to appoint a new vice president. And my friend Scott Armstrong was at the Washington Post at the time, and the Post had gotten a tip, and the tip was that the governor of Virginia, nice moderate Republican, Linwood Holton, would be the next vice president. And the Post believed it, and they assigned, I think, 6 stories on Linwood Holton and saved the space for 2 inside pages. And my friend Scott got into a cab that day, and the cab driver, a nice old Washington cab driver, said, "Well, Mr. Nixon's going to announce as vice president tonight." And Scott said, "Yeah, I know who it is." And this cab driver said, "That's funny, I know who it is too." And so they went back and forth, and "I'll tell you if you tell me." And Scott said, "It's going to be Linwood Holton." And the nice old Washington cab driver said, "No, it's not, it's going to be Gerald Ford." And they each said they knew for sure. So Scott bet this cab driver a dinner that it would be Linwood Holton, and found himself taking out his cab driver for a nice Washington dinner. So always be careful of the inside story. My subject today really is American power. I'm going to talk to some extent about Asia, but also the subject of my most recent a couple of books, which is the foreign policies of the last couple of administrations. And I have to say, in talking about American power, that I don't mean to say that I think power is, I don't mean to say that I'm in some way minimizing the importance of idealism and issues like social justice, because I tend to be something of an idealist myself, and I tend to be skeptical about exercises of power. But the fact is that they are a reality, that in my experience and readings of history, people who base their views strictly on ideals are led astray, whether it's people on the left in the 30s believing simply that the Soviet Union was the workers' paradise, or people on the right who thought that the invasion of Iraq was all about freedom and democracy, and discovering that things were a lot more complicated than that. So let me just start with an example really taken from this week's newspapers that describes what I think are some of the dilemmas of changing views of American power, both in the United States and elsewhere in the world. It's gradually, this is not new, something in the last 2 years, I think, has become clear that the United States is on the verge of some breakthroughs in energy through fracking and shale technologies that could, it seems, allow the country to become energy independent in the next 5 to 10 years, or to move close to it. And that's now taken as a likely possibility. So that raises several orders of questions as they've kind of developed in the consciousness of people thinking about foreign policy in Washington. So the first order question is, well, if we're energy independent, then maybe we don't need oil from the Middle East. And that's great. That's what we've been dreaming about for all these years when we've been supporting a bunch of dictators, felt that we had to support dictators and send them in the Middle East arms and money because their countries or their entire region was sitting on large oil supplies. That raises the second order question. Well, if we don't need oil from the Middle East, then maybe we can scale back on our troops and our other defense commitments there. Really, the United States military presence in the Middle East is something that really started in 1979, not all that long ago, under the Carter administration, with a new commitment to the Persian Gulf. So if we're energy independent, maybe we don't need bases in places like Bahrain. Maybe we don't even have as much of an interest as we used to in what happens to places in Kuwait or even Iraq. And in some ways, this is good for us, that we feel less obliged to have these security commitments. It's also however, very worrisome to some people, like, say, the government of Israel, which worries about us pulling back from the Middle East. And all of this has been kind of debated over the last couple of years, and now really in the last few weeks we're starting to see the next order of question, which is, okay, so maybe we can scale back from the Middle East, that's great, but we have a bunch of allies in Asia, long-standing allies, the Japanese, South Koreans, Philippines, others who need oil from the Middle East and who have been getting it under the protection of the United States Navy, protecting sea lanes and so on. They've relied on us to protect these oil supplies. So their supplies of energy from the Middle East are dependent on our presence. And in the last couple of months, really, you've seen these countries begin to worry about what happens if we scale back from the Middle East. And just in the last week, there was an article in the Financial Times by a guy named Kurt Campbell, who was, until recently, for the first 4 years of the Obama administration, the Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, really Hillary Clinton's point man for Asia. And Kurt Campbell was as instrumental as anybody in Washington for bringing about this policy, which is usually known as the pivot, in which the Obama administration pledged to refocus the attention and energy of American foreign policy towards Asia. And again, it was Kurt Campbell, among others, who came to Washington from all their trips in Asia, saying, we're not paying enough attention to Asia. We need to direct resources to Asia. Fine. Just this week, he's written in the Financial Times an op-ed that says, don't misunderstand this pivot. We have to do this right. We have to be responsible for the pivot, warning that we shouldn't pull out of the Middle East so fast because countries like the Japanese and the South Koreans don't want us to. They're nervous about it. They're happy to take the increased resources and attention, but they don't want it at the expense of a too fast a withdrawal from the Middle East. So I think that's, worrying really that suddenly, and people in Washington worried, that suddenly if we leave the Middle East, it will become either a source of intense competition among countries that haven't been competing, or that it will force these countries then to be dependent on some other country, translate China, to protect their oil supplies. So this, in my mind, is a great starting point, and it's a classic example in real time of the questions and dilemmas surrounding the future of American power in this era. There are debates, longstanding debates in Washington about whether the United States is in decline. I really don't particularly get moved by or swept up in those debates. It seems to me there are a couple of facts that are about American power that it seems to me are obvious, that whether you call it decline or not depends on whether you're focusing on military power, in which case, despite whatever budget cuts the United States does or doesn't make to the defense budget, the United States will remain by far the most powerful military in the world. I don't think that's not in question. I don't think decline really makes much sense in military terms. And in economic terms, I don't think there's much dispute about the fact that the United States is relatively weaker in relation to its standing of a couple of decades ago. That is, yes, there has been a decline. And so all of the debates about is America in decline or not really boil down to how you balance the two realities of continuing military power and declining economic power. And beyond that, people, depending on their own particular political agendas, have an interest in talking about decline or not. And those political interests sometimes work in funny ways, because it's in the interest of, hawks in the Republican Party to say the United States is not in decline, that we are much more, we are more powerful than people realize because their belief is in American power. And on the other side, it's in the interest of the Obama administration to say the United States is not in decline because they are conducting America's diplomacy. And it helps to not have people think that you're not on the way out. And as a symbol of the kind of funny allegiances that this kind of phony debate about decline produces, last year, one of the leading neoconservative thinkers, Bob Kagan, wrote a book saying the United States is not in decline, and Obama praised the book and began touting it to everyone else, because in different ways, they both have an interest in saying the United States is not in decline. I want to backtrack here and look at the issue of American power as derived by and in relation to our two main political parties. I have a particular interest in this because I did one book on George W. Bush's foreign policy team, Rise of the Vulcans, that came out in '04, and the new book on the Obama administration called The Obamians this year. So I've spent a bunch of time thinking about the two parties and their views of American foreign policy and their views of strategy and American power. And just first briefly on the Bush administration's team, which called themselves, and I called them in my book, the Vulcans. The Republicans on foreign policy, for all the divisions that they've had, and there are a lot of them, and I may talk some more about them, the Republicans tend to unify on a couple of things. One of them has been the importance of military power. So when you get to the George W. Bush administration, his personnel appointments at the beginning of the administration included two former defense secretaries, one former chairman of the Joint Chiefs. Even the Deputy Secretary of State was somebody who'd spent his career in the Pentagon. Even Condoleezza Rice had started in the Pentagon. Really, it was just overwhelmingly dominated with people whose main experience in foreign policy was on military affairs. And the Democrats are a complete contrast. I think sometimes the Democrats must sit around and say, is there anybody around here who wants to be defense secretary? And coming up with, not coming up with anybody or thinking they can't come up with anybody, we're now on our third straight Republican defense secretary for a Democratic president. That is, Bill Clinton's last defense secretary in his second term was Bill Cohen, a Republican, and Bob Gates, who was essentially a Republican, and now Chuck Hagel. So they couldn't be more different in their views of military power. And then the Republicans tend to unify on another thing, which is they take it for granted. They don't sort of examine the fact that the United States and United States power is essentially a force for good in the world. It's not something that they agonize about. Democrats, it's a more complicated story. So what do the Republicans disagree among themselves, and these agreements are often intense, on really the role of ideals in American foreign policy. That is, the people called the realists really believe that relations between countries are what counts, and tend to think, I've heard Brent Scowcroft, who's sort of the leading realist, say, and I think he would qualify it He was talking offhand, but said, it's really none of our business what happens inside a country's borders. All we care about is what they do externally outside their borders. I mean, that is the essence of the realist view. And then you can call them neoconservatives, hawks, people who believe that the United States does have an interest in what happens inside borders, and they tend to have a much stronger, even than other Republicans, a belief in the importance of military power. And at the end of the Cold War, there is a debate among Republicans about what American strategy should be. And inside the Pentagon, this is in George H.W. Bush 41's administration, a bunch of Republican foreign policy hands draft a document laying out a vision in which the United States should block the emergence of any rival power anywhere in Europe, Asia, or the Middle East, three main regions of the world for American foreign policy, that there should be no rivals. In fact, that the United States should develop its military power to such an extent that another government or another leader would be crazy to try and match American military power, because if he did that, the U.S. would be so far ahead he'd have to bankrupt his country. And this is essentially the Republican vision that comes to fruition in George W. Bush's administration. It is the most exaggerated view of American power and capabilities, and it doesn't, whatever you think of other parts of the war, even if you believed in it, it failed. I mean, it just, the war was a failure. Maybe George Bush doesn't say this. I'm still hoping to talk to him someday to ask whether, if you knew everything now, would you have mounted the invasion? And I don't know what he would say, but certainly by any other standards, it cost so much more in lives and in money that by their own standards and vision at the time, it was a failure. So my conclusion at the end of the Vulcan's book was that was the sort of the outer limits of American power, and that probably things would change after the Bush administration, and of course they did. So to turn to the Democrats now, obviously a very different course. So since the Vietnam War and in the immediate aftermath of the Vietnam War, you get a strong base in the party that comes out of the anti-war movement or grows out of the anti-war movement. Again, many fewer people in the party with interest and backgrounds in the military, much more in diplomacy. And the Democrats, for a good while after the Vietnam War, struggle with these issues that Republicans take for granted. I mean, after Vietnam, is the United States a force for good in the world? Should it maintain its involvements overseas? Or should it not? Should it pull back? And if you read the essays and the treatises of the 1970s, the thought leaders of the Democrats are people like the late Richard Holbrooke, who was then the editor of Foreign Policy magazine, a new magazine. Anthony Lake, later Bill Clinton's national security advisor. Zbigniew Brzezinski, who I think many of you know, who was Carter's national security advisor. And they're preoccupied with actually responding inside the party to the anti-war movement, saying, yes, we should stay involved overseas. Yes, America can, under other circumstances than Vietnam, be a force for good in the world. And this debate goes on really until the Democratic Party really begins to change at the time of the Persian Gulf War, when they're embarrassed. because this is the George Bush Senior administration goes to war with Iraq to get it to reverse its invasion of Kuwait. And the Democrats opposed the war on substantive and in some cases moral grounds, but also would make a whole bunch of predictions that turn out to be embarrassingly wrong. Leading people in the party, George Mitchell was a Senate Majority Leader, hand George Bush a letter saying, this is going to cost the loss of tens of thousands of American lives. 50,000 was one of the estimates used. And it turns out to be that the Democrats have actually underestimated America's military capabilities. In some ways, this is ironic because a lot of the new military technology at the time of the Persian Gulf War, what was then described as shock and awe, the high-tech weaponry, believe it or not, was developed in the Carter administration in the Defense Department by an actual Democrat, the Deputy Defense Secretary, Bill Perry. But one way or another, the Democrats get caught out, and they're determined not to make that mistake again, which will lead to further problems. So when you step back with the current administration, you see the evolution of the Democrats' foreign policy in 3 generations. There are 3 generations that have been all working together with considerable tension among the generations within the Obama administration. So the eldest generation is the post-Vietnam generation. And it includes people like Holbrooke, Vice President Biden, George Mitchell, and John Kerry, who I thought of, even in the first term, as essentially a part of the administration. He was, in a legitimate way, the administration's main defender in the Senate, and is now, of course, the Secretary of State. But this generation is men and women in their 60s and 70s who have, in their personal experience when they're starting in their careers, saw how the use of force can go disastrously wrong. And they tended to be extremely cautious about the use of force and particularly worried about America's image overseas. The next generation is the Clinton generation, and there's a substantial number of people in this Obama administration who really started their careers in foreign policy under Bill Clinton. Completely different perspective in terms of their direct experience. The Cold War has just ended. There's no rival to American power. America is being cited and thanked by the people of Eastern Europe for its opposition to the Soviets. There is a spirit of triumphalism in the 1990s. The American economy is booming, and the Clinton generation of officials tend to be extremely confident about American power. Probably the single catchphrase for this generation is one that was used. People associate with Madeleine Albright, Clinton's second Secretary of State. Actually, Clinton used it first, and that is the United States is the indispensable nation. Anywhere that there is conflict in the world, it usually needs the United States to be resolved. That's the second generation, and there are a whole bunch of people in the current Obama administration who served then, and that was their experience. I think of the current National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon, Hillary Clinton, who really started on foreign policy really came into foreign. She was working on domestic issues in 70s and 80s, and really, as First Lady, becomes involved in foreign policy. Then there are the Obamians, people who are really the subject of my book, who really didn't come into foreign policy until after 2001, until after September 11th, after the Iraq War, and they really have a completely different perspective. So I mentioned the Persian Gulf War before. The members of that 70s and 80s generation who had voted against the Persian Gulf War and were embarrassed by it. You come around to 2002 and 2003 as Bush is moving towards the Iraq War, and they famously vote for the authorization for the use of force in Iraq. This is Kerry, Biden, Hillary Clinton. Again, not wanting to seem as though they were in 1991, as they didn't want to seem as though they were opposed to the use of force in all circumstances. And so they were willing to go along with the Iraq War. And the Obama generation really came in at the time when they felt that the Democrats should be opposing the Iraq War more. And at one point in the interviews for my book, I asked a couple of these younger Obama generation people about the Democrats' vulnerabilities in political terms on foreign policy and national security. And I asked it, what about the political vulnerabilities that the Democrats always have? And I had in mind, but I wasn't specific in the question, I was thinking of the fact that ever since George McGovern, Democrats, whether it was McGovern or Michael Dukakis, are always attacked by Republicans for being weak on national security. But I didn't say it that way. I just asked about the political problems. And these guys said, oh, yeah, you mean the 2002 problem. And then I kind of snapped to, what are you talking about? Well, these Democrats who have to prove how hawkish they are, that's not us. So this generation has a different experience, different sense of where things are. One of the members of the Obama team said to me, all this talk about rising powers. And I said, yeah. I said, rising powers is the common phrase we all tend to use for China, India, Brazil. He said, I don't know what people are talking about. By the time we got to office, these powers weren't rising. They'd already risen. When we go deal with on international meetings, like on things like climate control, we find ourselves dealing with, as the major interlocutors for us, the people we have to deal with, China, India, Brazil. It's not as though there's some future thing. They're here. And that's kind of that's the youngest generation. And they so who are these people, by the way? Dennis McDonough, now the White House Chief of Staff. Ben Rhodes, recently profiled in the Times, who's kind of Obama's speechwriter, but a little bit more than that, kind of his thought and ideas guy. Susan Rice, who's the UN ambassador. There's a whole generation of people whose main perspective on foreign policy is really for the last 10 years. The ultimate member of this generation, of course, is Obama himself. He's the ultimate Obamian. That should not surprise anybody. And so where is Obama on questions of foreign policy or of America's role in the world? Well, I would say, first of all, as we've all seen, but people seem to be surprised in 2009, on questions involving the use of military force, this guy's not a dove. He's not a standard old line member of sort of grassroots anti-war movements or anything like that. And actually, people were wrong to think of him that way at the start. If they were paying attention, this is a guy who came to prominence for the first time, one of the earliest opponents of the Iraq War. It's a speech he gave as a state senator in 2002. But what did he say? He, remember, I think you've read his words, was, I'm not opposed to all wars, I'm opposed to dumb wars. And that implied that there might be wars that were not dumb. He didn't quite say it like that. When he actually mounted his presidential campaign in 2007 and 8, he said Iraq was the wrong war, and that the Bush administration should have been focusing on Afghanistan. And sure enough, when he took office, then he followed through with a surge in Afghanistan. He gave a Nobel Prize speech which stood out for saying, look, I am not Martin Luther King or Gandhi, I'm the President of the United States. So in all those ways, he's not a dove. On questions of America's role in the world, I would say that Obama is out there as a dove. He does qualify. He's much more willing to change the status quo than past presidents have been. You see it sometimes in his actions when he mounts an intervention in Libya by allowing the British and French to take the lead, or encouraging the British and French to take the lead. You see it in his speeches and his remarks. So other countries notice, and others in the US notice, when he says, as he said several times, the nation we care most about rebuilding is our own. And the one that actually raised some eyebrows overseas is this curious phrasing that he sometimes has. This is quoting from his speech on the surge in Afghanistan. More than any other nation, the United States of America has underwritten global security for over 6 decades, a time that for all its problems has seen walls come down and markets open and billions lifted from poverty, unparalleled scientific progress and advancing frontiers. Those are ringing words, but it's all in the what we would call in grammar the perfect tense. Okay, we have underwritten global security. It leaves hanging, okay, so is this period coming to an end? And I would suggest that for Obama that he's more willing to think through a new role for the United States than someone that simply underwrites global security. And in this sense, there is a difference, has been a shade of difference between Obama and Hillary Clinton. So I can tell you that in the summer of 2010, when Obama gives a speech announcing the end of combat operations in Iraq, he gives a speech about pulling out from Iraq, and the nation we care most about rebuilding is our own. And it's a very good speech. Nowhere in the speech, however, are commitments to, we're going to stay abroad in the same way as we did before, or commitments to allies. I mean, this is a speech meant for a domestic audience. But Hillary Clinton sees that speech and gets nervous. She has a different role. She's the Secretary of State. She thinks about foreign audiences. But one way or another, she didn't like leaving that speech as it was. And she went off and gave one of her main speeches as Secretary of State, something that she helped write personally about 10 days later, which is a reaffirmation of America's continuing commitments overseas, and it was a bunch of exhortations. This is the American century. This is our moment. This is our century. It's actually language that Mitt Romney consciously or unconsciously borrowed in some of his own speeches. Clinton really is of the 90s generation, uses approvingly the idea that the United States is the indispensable nation. And it's a reminder to all of you, all of our views of Hillary Clinton have changed a lot, I think, since the bitter 2007 and 8 campaign. When you think about it, when she ran for office, she had 3 strikes against her. One was that people thought she was just a vehicle for Bill Clinton to come back to the White House. The second was people thought, correctly, that she didn't have a lot of experience in foreign policy. And the third was that she was too hawkish for the base of the Democratic Party, that she was a hawk, and the Democratic Party base reacted in the aftermath of Iraq, reacted to that. And she's completely dispelled the first two of those. I mean, no one thinks anymore that she's the vehicle for Bill to become president again, or that she doesn't know about foreign policy. And the funny thing is, people don't focus on the third part, which is that her views are really the same. They haven't changed at all. I mean, she really is a relatively hawkish. Her views on foreign policy remain relatively hawkish. Now, I want to turn to Asia for a few minutes, because we have, in 2011, Obama goes out and announces that the United States is going to proceed with this pivot towards Asia, refocus its energies there. And I would submit to you that the administration is going ahead with that pivot, still trying to figure out what it means, and is struggling with the fact that it can come into conflict with two other strands of American policy. One is the defense budget, which is being cut. People in Asia will tell you that on the military side, the fact that Obama is going to put 2,500 Marines in Australia doesn't amount to much. Certainly at the time the administration announced it, that was only going to be a first step. Well, how do you step up American military involvement in Asia while cutting the defense budget? That's a tough question. And how do you maintain efforts in the Middle East? So all of these things are coming into conflict with one another. And meanwhile, there's the question of China. And the Obama administration, like other administrations, it seems to be a pattern that the Obama administration follows in reverse, which is that administrations take office and say and intend to do one thing on China, and it lasts for about a year, and then they turn around and do the opposite. And what made Obama go through the reverse pattern was that they were determined that they were not going to take office breathing fire on China. We're going to confront them. And they were determined to have a good relationship. And the problem is that they ran up into the fact that China was in a very different phase, and that each time the Obama administration tried to be conciliatory towards China, China kept upping the ante and objecting more and more. And it got to the point where other countries in Asia, around the beginning of 2010, of all people, the Vietnamese were the first, were coming to Washington saying, China is threatening us. They're all over the South China Sea with their, whether it's maritime exploration or one way or another. You need to be to work with us more, and to help us more to maintain our independence from China. And starting in 2010, the Obama administration becomes increasingly tougher in dealing with China, and Hillary Clinton is actually instrumental on this. In the middle of that year, she goes out and sort of lines up with all the other Asian countries to say, we believe in freedom of navigation, and essentially rejecting the Chinese claim that it was the sovereign power over all of the South China Sea. I think in the broader sense, we have seen over the last couple years really past views and policies towards China begin to run out. One of them is, I would call, the Kissinger relationship, which is, grew out of the Cold War, is we need to do whatever we can to preserve our relationship with China for its own sake. And really, Kissinger became the persona for a policy that stayed and continued for longer than it may have been wise to continue. There's also a Clinton version of the China policy, kind of based on the view that trade and investment are going to bring political liberalization in China. It was just something that was a view that was common in the 1990s, It was in some ways linked to the intellectual Francis Fukuyama's view that this was the end of history and all countries were going to lead towards democracy. And I think that view of China has run out too. And we're now at a point, I think, where things are very up in the air that between the United States and China. And I've never seen a time in my 25 years or so watching where American policy towards China is going to depend over the next few years on what China does. I mean, really, China could decide it needs to work out a relationship with the United States, or there are plenty in the Chinese leadership and military who think that the time to do that is over, and there are, the hawks within China and within the Chinese government have gained much greater power. And I don't know how that's going to work out with the new Chinese leadership, but really I think American policy now depends to a large extent on China. So let me just finish with where are the two major political parties now on questions of America's role in the world. Republicans are facing some old divisions, not the ones that people have seen more recently between neoconservatives and realists like George Bush Sr. and Brent Scowcroft, but old divisions between both of them, the neoconservatives and realists on the one hand, and a isolationist wing of the party symbolized now by Rand Paul, and before that by his father, Ron Paul. And I think the New York Times did a story a couple of weeks ago. This is a new development for the Republicans. It's not new at all. It's something that has come up decade after decade. In the 1990s, the Republicans in Congress strongly opposed the Clinton administration's military action in the Balkans. And in fact, in those years, as happens from time to time, the neoconservatives, who again are less partisan than just a belief in American military power, supported Clinton over the Republicans in Congress. So this is an old thing that's starting to reemerge. In fact, during the campaign, in the middle of the fall campaign last year, I was kind of amused because in September and October, on the one hand, I found Democratic friends saying, that Romney campaign, it's nothing but a bunch of neoconservatives and they'll do anything to block Obama. And there are ways in which that was true, and there are ways in which it wasn't. So for a good part of October, after the incidents in Benghazi and at the U.S. Embassy in Cairo, the Republicans in Congress were moving to cut off all aid to Egypt. And the Obama administration won the support of the neoconservatives, who, after all, care about American involvements in power overseas, who, as opposed to the Republicans, were supporting the Obama administration and the preservation of foreign aid. So that's the Republican side of the equation. On the Democratic side, I take it for, I assume that Hillary Clinton is thinking about running for president. I think she should. And as I said, she's far more liked and admired than in 2008. She remains, at best, centrist, but fairly hawkish on American foreign policy. So if you put those together, it's even imaginable that in the 2016 elections, the Democrats will be more hawkish than they've been for years, and the Republicans, if the Rand Paul wing of the party emerges on top, could be more dovish than they've been for years. But, above and beyond that, the American role in the world, I think the U.S. will be ever less insistent on being the single dominant player the old role that it's played since World War II. Thanks very much.